Welcome to the MAM journals. Today I'm going to be talking about the Ducati RS4 range and in particular obviously this bike, which is the Testastretta engine and the last of them of this particular range. I think it'd probably be useful if I do an introduction as to how the Monster range actually started, then be covering, as I say, the four models that were in the S4 range. We'll then do a technical walk around and I'll go through the specific specifications of this bike. I'd then like to sort of take it outside into the light and maybe compare it with a couple of other bikes which might help you get some sort of framework to operate on. We're obviously going to talk about what it's like to ride, which is interesting, and I'll obviously then be making some final concluding remarks. I hope you enjoy the video. The Monster range was actually introduced in 1993 with the M900, which was actually originally designed to be a Cagiva until the very last moment when they decided to put the Ducati brand on it. If the 916 was the bike that put Ducati back in the charts, the Monster range, and they've sold over 300,000 since it was first introduced, was probably the bike that kept Ducati solvent. So a big contribution to the success of the Ducati brand. Now, the original 900 was a fairly low-tuned bike. It was a 903cc engine bike out of, I think it was the 900 Supersport. It was in the 888 chassis and with 750 Supersport suspension on it. And it was healthy performance, but certainly not monstrous. It took a little while until they gradually brought these bikes out, which had the liquid-cooled engines. As I say, the original bike was air and oil cooled, but it had no radiator on. And the purists enjoyed the simplicity of the original Monster range. This range was slightly more controversial, and let's go through some of the specifications of how they developed this range. The S4 range came out in 2001, and it was actually initially fitted with the 916 engine, produced 101 brake horsepower. In terms of suspension, it had showers at the front and Sachs piggyback at the back, and I think the major visual difference, of course, was that they had a conventional swinging arm on the back like the Monster, as opposed to the mono that appeared on the S4R onwards. They're probably the best value for bikes for the S4 and nowadays in terms of trying to pick one up if you're interested in doing that. And they actually made a foggy replica, obviously to celebrate his success in the World Superbikes, and they're quite attractive in their own right. The S4R came out in 03 and that was fitted with a 996 engine. That produced 117 brake horsepower, and that had shower fronts, shower rears, and as I mentioned earlier, it had the mono swing arm at the back, and they then actually put what's called the narrowhead, the Testastretta. If you look at the sign here, this Testastretta engine actually first came out in 2001 with a bike I'll be comparing this to later, the 996R, which was actually not 996, it was 998. And Testastretta, for those of you not familiar, it means narrowhead. And so the first of the times where they put that engine in was in 07. And that produced 130 brake horsepower. Now I'm a bit confused because looking at the manual, it suggests that it produced something like 119 at the crank, but I'll be honest, every other independent source that I've gone to says that these bikes this engine produced 130 brake horsepower, and it certainly feels more like that when you ride it than 119, which would actually be less than my SP1 and probably equal to my Kawasaki ZRX, both of which I'm going to be, as I say, doing some comparative comments. The S4R was when they introduced these wide alloy wheels. They all have Marcosi, I think however you pronounce that. They all had those, all of the S4 range had those on, but this they introduced for the narrow head these Y-shaped wheels, and all the way along they had various degrees of what I would describe as bling as a collective, in terms of carbon bits or anodized or whatever other parts they put on it. Okay, so let's talk about this particular bike. Obviously it's the last of the S4 and the RS version, and engine wise, as I've touched on, this produced I think 104 newton meters at 7,500 and 130 brake horsepower overall. It's the brakes on both this and the 74R were both they're Brembos, as indeed were all of them, but these are the radials that fitted on that. At the front you've got two times 320mm 4-pot discs, and at the rear you've got 2 piston single. The brakes are very good, as you expect for Brembos, but as you can see by looking on them, there's no ABS, which again I'll touch on later. In terms of the exhaust, you'll see from it, in fairness, this is a one owner bike. I'm the second owner, and he kept the bike in very nice condition, for which I'm obviously grateful, and one of the reasons I bought it. And he perhaps slightly less keen on cleaning exhaust than I am, and I'm just gradually working my way through that, and I'll get that to be a bit cleaner. The bike came standard with these exhausts on it. A lot of people opted for the Turgomonis. Ducati sort of learned a trick or two as they went. When you originally used to buy sports bikes, they used to give you the option. I remember I bought one of the first 748. It was in SP. They went on later to ours, but mine was called the SP, the first one. And you actually got both exhausts. You got standard road exhausts, and you got Turgomonis and a chip to put it in. So, funnily enough, I've probably still got the standard exhaust somewhere in the garage, because you can tell which ones I chose to use. They do produce a nice sound, but in standard version, but the Turgomonis obviously produce a nicer sound. While we're talking about noise, it's obviously got a dry clutch, as is synonymous with these models, and yeah, it does all the rattling and banging that you associate with those dry clutches, and they do quite a lot of work. So it's fairly common to have need to replace them between 5,000 and 7,000 miles. So don't be alarmed if you're looking at one and you think, well, that clutch might have done some work. They do work normally, and if somebody's a bit more enthusiastic, then clearly it might be slightly less miles than that, but you just have to view that as service items. The bike has been tested, and I'm assuming this is an accurate test because the precision of the number is at 153.4 miles an hour, and in terms of range and tank, the tank holds 15 litres. I haven't got round to measuring it. I've done approaching sort of 300 miles, just less, and I've had 2 tankfuls in it, so roughly translating in my head 30 litres into gallons, that's 6.6. Sometimes I wish I hadn't started something, but I'm going to finish, so that's going to be 39 miles per gallon. And I've been riding it enthusiastically, but not ridiculously. So I suspect people can get it less than that or more than that, depending on how sensible you are on the day. Okay, I've got some bikes out because I thought it'd be useful to do some comparisons, and I think the first thing I'd say is these are sort of a generational bike when you had comparatively high power and no tech. And I meet lots of motorcyclists, and really we fall into 3 camps. We fall into the real men don't need technology camp, the why on earth would you ride anything that hasn't got technology nowadays, and people like me, and probably a increasing number of people who actually have a foot in both camps. I used to be in the former camp, as in, you don't need technology, but a slow wobble round on 1,000 RR at a Donington race circuit and without the technology on convinced me that mere mortals do actually enjoy the benefits of technology. Indeed, that's the reason why they put them on. But these are very characteristic bikes, and although I get criticised for saying so, you need to be a bit careful riding them because they can catch you out. So I've chosen these bikes for for a reason to do the comparison. Actually, the Ducati 996R, don't be fooled by the labelling, is actually the 998 engine. That was the first of the Testastretta engines that came out, and you can see the similar radiator and oil cooler configuration down on the bottom there, and obviously more obscured with the fairing than it is here. But both of them, they need to be exposed. You can't really put covers on them because both of those engines run pretty hot. The reason why they got liquid cooling is because it needs it. So you do get pick up some stone damage and various chips on it as you go. This bike was a bike, the ZRX was a bike that was on paper, you'd sort of compare, it's actually the same year, both of those bikes were registered in 2008, that you'd say on paper were very comparable in performance, but this at £545 is £100 heavier than the Ducati. In terms of dimensions, obviously the sports bike has got that ultimate, short wheelbase. I'm going to make it simple. Call it 55 inches wheelbase, 56, and a more lengthy 57 inches. In terms of geometry and rake, i.e. sharpness of steering when you're actually riding it in terms of the geometry, that is adjustable because it was a homologation bike for World Superbikes, so you can actually set that to 23.5 degrees or up to 24.5 degrees. This is 24 degrees, so quite sharp for an open naked bike, so quite quick on the steering. And this, I haven't actually found any technical measurements, but I suspect it's 25, 26 degrees rake. So again, giving that extra stability in terms of how you ride it. In terms of purchase pricing, just to give you an interesting comparison between the two, that was £5,700 new. That was £9,400, and that, a much earlier bike, 2001 bike, was €25,000. So depending on what your exchange rate, sort of somewhere between £15,000 and £20,000. So very different price ranges in that. They all, as I say, share this lack of technology, and all of them are perfectly capable, if you don't ride them properly, of throwing you into the undergrowth at quite a rate of knots. So they have to be ridden with respect. None of them have got to be ABS, none of them have got traction control, none of them have got anti-wheelie or anything of that nature. You just ride it on the pure power, which is a great experience in itself, but to be treated carefully, let's put it like that. Okay, so let's talk about riding the bike. I've done less than 300 miles, but I've got a pretty good clarity in my mind about what it's like to ride. The riding position is slightly unusual, as you can see by the photograph. It's ideally suited to somebody like me who's got short legs but with longer arms than I've got. So if there's anybody out there that fits that criteria, this is just the thing. So you do have a sort of forward weight position when you're actually riding the bike. The bike handles very well. It's got very good suspension, but like most sports suspension, it's quite firm. So it performs better when it's loaded up. You don't. It's not a bike for pottering around on with the suspension. It will take your fillings out, and you'll be booking yourself in with a chiropractor fairly quickly. But in terms of when you drive, it's not like the 996R. The 996R was virtually the end of the development of the 916 models, and by the time they got to the stage of the 996R, I mean, they'd really got it balanced, and you just look at an apex and the bike's on its way. This bike takes more physical input, but once you've actually got it cranked over, or you're going for the corner and you picked your line, then it is very good suspension, and I'm sure that really good riders will have no trouble handling these quite briskly. In terms of riding it, because it's not got technology, you can't take the liberties that you can with modern bikes with all the technology on it. I mean, I have to remind myself, I like both types, I have to remind myself after I get off of a modern bike that this hasn't got ABS, so funnily enough I've got to get my braking point right and make sure I get there, and because of the nature of there's no traction control or anything like that, you've got to get your line right because it's got a lot of power, particularly in that sort of a lot of torque, and traction control is down to you and the throttle. Nothing else is going to save you, and even in the 300 or less than 300 miles that I've done, it's already put the manners on me a couple of times, which I've actually enjoyed, but I think it's only right to mention it, that they are, it's a proper bike. You do 2 hours on one of these and you get it right, yeah, I mean, it's very satisfying to actually ride it, but you need to concentrate on what you're doing because of the nature of the performance. One of the questions that was asked of me, and we should probably cover, somebody came up and said, oh, I bet that's good for wheelies, and I did sort of say at the time, well, I don't really do wheelies, and if I say something like that in front of friends that I spent my well-spent youth with, they'll find that comment hysterical, because I spent most of my time on one wheel, and one particular friend reminded me, quite rightly, that every time he got on the back of my RD 400, my party trick was to see if I could get it to 80 degrees and get him off the back. So I'm not adverse to wheelies. I don't tend to do them now. I've had 4 fights with a surgeon, and on the basis I've lost all of them. You won't be surprised to hear that I'm not ever so keen to have another one. If for no other reason, I don't fancy the recovery period. I like riding bikes, not looking at them, so I do ride a bit more circumspectly than I used to, but in terms of wheelies, if I just go through the 3 bikes, the 996R, I mean, if you don't get a wheelie out of a 996R when you're riding it enthusiastically, you're not trying hard enough. But it's not a bike that naturally comes up and you've got your weight over the front, so it's much more predictable and easy to manage. The ZRX, you don't actually, although it's got lots of power, and I know people that have great fun mono wheeling those, it's not a bike that, even ridden reasonably enthusiastically, is going to spend much of its time pouring air there. But this bike, whether you want to do wheelies or not, if you ride it with any degree of enthusiasm, you will end up doing a wheelie, and it's partly because of that wheelbase, because it's quite short, partly because of the geometry in the riding position with the big wide bars, the torque and the pivot point. So as I say, in less than 300 miles I've had this thing up numerous times. It's lifted the wheel just a few inches, and I've had 2 proper this high sort of wheelies. One when I tried it on a performance on a quiet road just to see what the acceleration was, and once when it just hit a small undulation in a road when I was pressing it under load, 7,500 revs, maximum torque, up it came, and I had to click up a couple of gears to get it down sensibly. So although I don't try to do wheelies, there's no question in my mind that I will spend a fair amount of my time on one wheel just trying to get the thing to get back down again. So it's very exciting to ride, but if you don't like wheelies, don't buy one of these, because it doesn't come in the non-wheelie version. So good fun. So what are my concluding thoughts on this bike? Okay, so concluding thoughts really, I mean, these were the last of the generation that didn't have the technology on, and certainly the 1100, which was based on the 1098 Ducati engine. I had a few of those, they were nice bikes. They increased the power, 155 brake horsepower from memory, but they put traction control and various other things on. So these are sort of the last of the pure high performance, no technology sort of bikes really, and they are great fun to ride, and I'm sure my cautionary tales will have annoyed the purists who's just saying, well, man up, get on, ride it. But I make these videos for 3 reasons, mostly, if I'm honest, to amuse myself, secondly to entertain others if they care to watch the videos, and thirdly to inform. And I don't think I'd be doing a very good job if I didn't tell people the reality of what these sort of bikes are and what they're about. If you're a born again biker and feel and have now in a position where you've got the money to buy one of these, make sure that you know, having the money to buy one and having the ability to ride it are not necessarily the same things. So if you're going to ride one of those, please be careful with it unless you are experienced. I mean, riders who don't ride any bikes with technology find these straightforward, just faster versions of what they're already used to. But if you have got used to technology, be careful. But I do like them. When I got this bike, I posted on one of the forums about it, and somebody made me laugh and said, yeah, well, that'll put hairs on your chest, and they're certainly right. And a very close friend of mine, he does a lot of work on my bikes and helps me out a lot, used to work with Ducati at this sort of period, and when I turned up on that, he just laughed and said, that'll be teaching you a lesson or two. So they are, you know, quite well known for it. But how would I like to conclude? Well, the Oxford definition, I'm just going to read this if I may, is a monster is an imaginary creature, unusually large and frightening, compounded of incongruous elements. If nothing else, they got the name right. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, then you'd be kind enough to press like and maybe even subscribe if you enjoyed it. But what I do hope that you do is ride safe and stay well.